So these notes are going to be over the interwar years as a whole, which covers 5.3, 5.4, and 5.5, with a focus on kind of the Roaring Twenties and how America changed after World War I, but right before the Great Depression and World War II. So the vocab that we're going to go over today, the most important one is the Great Migration. And the Great Migration is simply the movement of African Americans from the South to the North. This is going to be one of the biggest demographic changes in the United States. And the reason that African Americans leave, we went over this a little bit, is the jobs available in the factories in the North during World War I, and to leave kind of the racism of the South. And inflation is a rise in the price of goods and services, so it's where your money is worth less, so that loaf of bread that may have been $1 suddenly cost $1.25. A creditor nation is a nation which is owed money from other countries. Installment buying and buying on margin we're going to go over a little bit, but I put the definitions there so you can have them. So we're going to start first with the politics in the 1920s. This is kind of very simple. You're going to see a common theme in a lot of it. So after the progressive presidents, the country swings back to the Republicans with Harding and Coolidge. They're both Republicans. They both reject progressive ideas. It's not that they don't believe in helping the average American citizen. They are very much that the government should get out of people's way. They go back to that laissez-faire, so that hands-off view of the government. The government doesn't deal that much with the average citizen. It's not the government's job. The biggest thing they do is they cut spending. So they cut the army, they cut social spending, they cut all kinds of spending, and that leads to a surplus. So the United States is making more money than it's spending. This is what's going to lead to the 1920s, that really big economic boom time in the United States. They still believe in a lot of the goals of the progressives. They still want to see things get better for a lot of the classes, but they support volunteerism to achieve a lot of the progress. They want people to voluntarily donate to charities, to give to, their churches, instead of having the government mandate a lot of those social programs. The issue with Harding especially is corruption. So Harding himself wasn't corrupt, but he had picked very bad advisors. He was way too trusting to be the president. He had what was called the Ohio Gang, which were his friends essentially and his poker and drinking buddies who he made his advisors. And they would sit around at night, play poker, and talk about what should be done to run the country. Those guys would accept bribes. They would misuse government funds. They do all kinds of shady stuff. The biggest one was the Teapot Dome scandal, where his Secretary of the Interior illegally leased land to companies so that they could drill for oil on it. And then he got bribes in return. After Harding, Coolidge would kind of end that. He would pick better advisors. He would pick people more on their skills and experience, and would kind of revive trust in the government a little bit. So now we get into the Roaring Twenties, probably the most important piece of this whole unit. So the Roaring Twenties is the entire 1920s, pretty much, and we've gone over it a little bit. It's called the Roaring Twenties because the United States had a ton of money during this time period. Post-World War I, the United States economy completely begins to change. The U.S. shifts from a wartime to a peacetime economy. This causes a small recession because suddenly this military spending all ends. Women leave their factory jobs, so there's less money going into the economy. And the Great Migration caused a lot of racial tensions. You can see that in that picture on the left-hand side. You have white soldiers and black soldiers both coming home and both competing for the same jobs. I love that picture, just on a side note, because of the kid in the background, just posing for the camera. But the biggest thing is the United States economy wasn't touched by World War I. None of our factories were destroyed. None of our cities were destroyed. Everything was intact. So we are the world's biggest industrial power now. So if anybody needs anything, they come to the United States. The American economy during this time period grows for a couple reasons. One is consumerism. Wages had risen after World War I, and when all the goods stopped being manufactured for the military and started being manufactured for people again, this caused a huge boom in consumer goods. The economy went crazy because of this, because people wanted to buy washing machines, dishwashers, they wanted cars. The growth, though, was funded by credit, just like it is today. And that back then they called it installment buying. You'd put a small down payment on something, and then you would pay off the rest in monthly payments. And that's fine as long as money is always coming in. But the minute that people can't pay back those payments, it causes kind of a ripple effect. We'll see with Great Depression. So you have to understand installment buying. The second big reason is the stock market. The stock market, where you can invest and buy little pieces of companies have become accessible to the average American, and that's because of buying on margin. This is essentially installment buying for buying stock. So you would buy stock on credit with a little down payment, and then you would pay off the rest monthly. That's fine as long as your stock continues to grow. If it doesn't, suddenly you have to pay back the loan you took out, and you're in the hole because your stock went down. The average American, because of all this, the average American's debt exponentially increases. All of a sudden, Americans are taking on more and more debt. And as long as they're able to pay it back in those small monthly payments, it's okay. We'll see during the Great Depression, that dries up and it collapses the economy. There's a big social revolution that occurs during this time period. In the 1920s, 50% of all houses in the U.S. had electricity. And I know that doesn't seem like a lot to us, but that was huge back then, okay? This leads to the growth of a lot of different gadgets that people have in their homes and a lot of different products. One of those ones is the radio. So pretty much every single house had a radio one way or another. They would have it on a generator or hooked up the electric grid. And that advertising on the radio helped spread the consumer culture around the country. People wanted the products that they heard of the radio. They wanted the music. They wanted all those things that they were hearing. Movies begin to spread during this time. This is how you would get your news. You would go to the movie theater and you would watch the news, and then you would watch a movie. Pretty much all Americans began to take part in it because it was so cheap that all Americans were able to go. The phonograph spreads music. It's vinyl records, if you've ever seen a record player. And it began to spread kind of a standard American music. Those two musics will be jazz and country western. Jazz will be the most important during the 1920s by far. The last piece is car culture. The Model T, made by Ford, was the first mass-produced car, and it was cheap. Ford's joke was you could get the car in any color as long as it was black. They were standardized. They were all the same. This leads to the growth of a lot of other industries like tourism, hotels, gas stations have to be built, which provides more jobs, more money being pumped into the U.S. economy. This connects the rural areas and the suburbs to the cities now. So travel becomes easier. It's easier for people to get products, easier for people to go to the movies, and again, the economy grows. Down at the bottom, and you can't see it very well, but the results of this is it's a spread of a standard American culture. Suddenly, the country begins listening to the same music. They begin going to the same places. They begin watching the same movies. And it standardizes the United States. And that's going to be one of the big things. Think about it like this. I could drop you off in a high school in California, and you would fit in perfectly fine because our culture is very standard now. Everybody does kind of the same stuff. So you can see some of the aspects here. The jazz singer, this is the first song or first movie with sound to it. You have Ford and his Model T here, ladies listening to the radio, okay? All these kind of standard American cultural pieces. So the highway system was another big piece of this. You can see that during the 1920s, the highways begin to be built across the United States to connect the country together by car. A major change during this time period, socially as well, is with women. So they called it the New Woman Movement, kind of. These are younger women, a lot of them who either were nurses during World War I or they worked in the factories during World War I, and they reject the traditions of the old world, and they're going to be called the flappers. So these are young women who bobbed their hair, they wore shorter dresses, they listened to jazz, they were kind of like the rebellious young ladies of the time period. And they represent kind of that new American woman who's born during the 1920s. They're like the 20-somethings. So you can see the flappers up here compared to how their mothers would have dressed. You can see the longer dresses here, more covered up, and then obviously the shorter dresses, and their hair is very, very short. The Lost Generation is kind of a change in American writing. These are writers who, after World War One, a lot of them had fought in World War One, and they look for different ways to express themselves. It can be very confusing. They thought that World War One kind of made society lose its way. So they look for new ways to express emotions. They're very, very abstract. I touch on them because sometimes they come up. Some of those names, like Ernest Hemingway, Scott Fitzgerald, and Zelda Fitzgerald, come up. But a lot of their books are now considered American classics. So this is something you definitely want to star, which is the Jazz Age. So jazz greatly influences the culture of the United States. It's a fusion of pretty much every music style that had been in the United States: blues, ragtime, country, Afro-Cuban, and it all comes together into jazz. And this is the party music of the time period. Um, it's what's played in the speakeasies. It's what everybody's listening to. It's what the flappers like. And it's going to spread across the country. It's going to spread across the world and really spread American culture very quickly. This video is kind of interesting. It just goes over how jazz led to most modern American music styles. Lastly, we have the Harlem Renaissance. So the Harlem Renaissance is caused by the Great Migration and immigration increasing from the Caribbean, places like Jamaica, Haiti. Harlem in New York became mostly African American during this time period. There was a huge influx. We're talking hundreds of thousands within just a few years. And it led to the growth of a black middle class, a very, very wealthy, as you can see right here, black middle class. And a lot of them were artists or began owning businesses and especially clubs in that area, which would play jazz. So this caused the rise of new African American leaders from this time period, and one of them was Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey was a Jamaican immigrant, and he disagrees with W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, who he went over. His whole thing was he thought that black people everywhere on the planet were exploited, including in Africa. It didn't matter where they were, they all had kind of this common bond of being exploited. So he supports what's called black nationalism, and the idea that black people need to have their own nation, okay? And obviously, he kind of supports Africa. He supports what's called the Back to Africa movement, where African Americans in the United States should immigrate back to Africa and build Africa as kind of a united Pan-African society. The Harlem Renaissance also resulted in a lot of art. This was called the New Negro Movement, and it was a pride in a shared African American culture that all African Americans kind of had this connection to each other because of their shared history. And it focused a lot on race relations between whites and blacks. And it was done through writing, painting, poetry mostly. And like Claude McKay up here, he's the more militant side of it. He thought that discrimination completely flavored everything for African Americans. Langston Hughes, who we're going to study later, is the most famous. He kind of celebrated African American life and the struggles African Americans had been through and said that it was like a bonding thing. And Zora Neale Hurston was an author, and her whole thing, she focused on the cultural heritage of African Americans, especially African American women. So I know this was quick. I hope it helps you understand the 1920s a little bit more. If you have any questions, please let me know.